this is a massive offseason for them. And I think that this coaching staff seems to have recognized the gravity of that and attacked the transfer portal very heavily. And again, I think brought in some players that they expect and hope to make immediate impact for Kansas in 2026, because this is setting up to be sort of a potential watershed year in the direction of Lance Leipold at Kansas. Pay heed, all who enter, and beware this podcast. That's right. This is the Pay Heed podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. If you haven't already, please subscribe on Apple and Spotify for audio, and you'll want to be subscribed on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN, because that's where we do our YouTube live shows, including a big one coming up this Saturday afternoon. We'll be live after KU takes on BYU. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. If you watched that BYU-Arizona game, that was on Monday night, we've gotten a little bit of a taste of potentially what KU may be in store for when BYU visits Allen Fieldhouse on Saturday. The students were already out camping on Tuesday morning, so shout out to the students. It's going to be a big game. We're going to be live on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN right after the game concludes for our post-game reaction, and you should come join us if you aren't planning on going to the game. Come join us, hang out with us, and hang out with many other great KU fans. We had so many people joining us for the previous live show that we did for KU and K-State. It was a ton of fun. Lots of great KU fans joined us. You can share your comments, share your thoughts, ask questions live in the YouTube chat. All the more reason is to say that you should be subscribed at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. We are so close, by the way, to 1,500 subscribers. We're very, very close. So absolutely hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you have, thank you so much. You can also continue to obviously like all of our videos on YouTube and share your comments, share your thoughts, ask questions. We do read the comments, yes. So please continue to do so. And we thank you so much if you have done that in the past. And we hope that you continue to do so as well and help us continue to grow this great KU community that we have here at KCSN. We are going to be breaking down KU and BYU, doing a little bit of a deeper preview of it coming up later on in the week. As for today's show, though, we haven't really had a full chance to do this, so I thought it would be a good time to do it with KU basketball having a bit of an extended break in between games. And that is, we spent a ton of time over the past 3 weeks, basically going back to the start of January, talking about the KU football transfer portal, breaking down the players as they were committing. It was obviously a very hectic time for Kansas. They were getting commits left and right. We did several shows kind of breaking down commitments as they were happening, but wanted to take the opportunity today to talk about this class holistically, what it means for Kansas, and sort of set the stage for spring ball, which is coming up in basically a month or so for Kansas, where we'll get a chance to see some of the guys in action, talk to some of the players, talk to some of the position coaches. But as it stands, Kevin, just to tee off this show here, overall thoughts on KU football's transfer portal and maybe how things played out. Did it kind of unfold as you expected? Was there anything that surprised you? What were your overall takeaways?
You know, I like this class. I'm not sure there are as many sort of upper tier guys as I thought there were a year ago. With some of the guys like Emmanuel Henderson was a guy that we loved right off the bat and thought, hey, this is a terrific guy. But I think that one of the things they did was they filled in a lot of holes defensively. And we'll talk more about that specifically, but they filled in gaps where they had gaps, and they got more depth where they needed more depth, and they did a really good job there. And then offensively, when you add in Andy Kotelnicki and the guys that they brought in, one of the good things about Andy Kotelnicki's offense, and again, I feel like we say this, we don't know exactly what role Andy Kotelnicki is going to have. We haven't had a chance to have those discussions just yet. I'm sure we'll have those in the spring, but I'm sure that it will be to some semblance at least Andy Kotelnicki's offense. And the strength of that offense, Nick, is the fact that it relieves the tension on any specific position. The way that you have the motion, the misdirection, all of those different things. You don't necessarily need to have a 1,500-yard back because you can have 2 or 3 backs that you can spread that across. You don't need to have your quarterback be a 3,500, 4,000-yard passer because you're going to spread that around. You don't need to have a 1,200-yard receiver because you're going to put the ball in the hands of different guys, and that relieves a lot of the pressure there. Having said that, I thought they did a really nice job of basically filling out their offensive weapons group, especially late. When you look at a guy like Dylan Edwards coming in, he would be sort of the one guy offensively that I feel like when you look at it, you say this is a potential all Big 12 guy from a football standpoint. I think Dylan's probably that guy. And so generally speaking, taking 30 guys, would you have loved to have, a player who was going to be ranked in the top 20, top 50, guys in portal rankings? Of course. But I think that Dylan has that kind of potential on down the line. I think they have guys that have a chance to be really, really effective for him this year. And when you add the returning guys that they bring back on defense, I really thought they did a nice job of filling everything out.
I think I would say this as it relates to your last point about the portal rankings. I think the portal rankings are totally irrelevant. I don't care about them. I don't care what they say. I don't care where KU's ranked, which, by the way, I looked at 24/7 Sports. They're like 52 in the transfer portal rankings. But I don't care. I don't think it matters because for a couple reasons. Number one, as we've certainly seen with Kansas basketball, I think over the past couple years in the transfer portal, it's more about fit than anything else, right? You can have a great player or a very talented player who maybe you evaluate as being this great player, but if you put him in the wrong system, it's not going to work, right? And in football, you see that too, I think, as well with different guys. So I don't care about the rankings. I don't care what the rankings say. As you mentioned, KU only had all 3-star guys. I don't care. It's more about fit. It's more about how this team comes together in totality. So that was kind of one of my takeaways, truthfully, was like, hey, whatever the rankings say, it doesn't really matter because they're kind of all over the place. If you're somebody who looks at different recruiting sites, if you're to look at On3 versus 24/7 Sports, they're totally different. They have totally different formulas for how they get their rankings. Like, it's all irrelevant. At the end of the day, it just comes down to your coaching staff and their ability to evaluate guys that they think will fit into what you're trying to accomplish at your program. And we'll see if Kansas did a good job of that, right? Obviously, they brought in a ton of guys. And the other point that I thought was relevant is you're talking about a program that for the past 2 seasons, really, going back to 2024, has had very, very large senior classes departing the program. Over 30 players in 2024. Another round this year where they had a lot of guys end up departing the program to graduation and out of eligibility. And quite frankly, the high school classes that Kansas has had have not been able to replenish that. Just from strictly a numbers standpoint, right? You can argue about whether or not Kansas has done a good job evaluating high school recruits or not, but just from strictly a numbers standpoint, they were losing more guys than they had really in the high school ranks ready to step up into key positions. And so this offseason specifically, I think Kansas really did a nice job of going out and finding players with experience and guys that, you hope can step in and play at this level. Friend of the show, Derek Johnson, I think tweeted this, that Kansas has brought in via the transfer portal a total of 8,000 career snaps across all the guys that they have committed to come to KU. I think that's very significant, right? Because you've brought in players that have already had the chance to play, and now they're going to have a chance at Kansas to maybe prove themselves. They've added a ton of experience, which I think is incredibly important because when you look at, especially on the offensive side, and we'll get into this, you're going to have a new quarterback, right? So you want players, I think, around him on offense specifically, and on the defensive side, quite frankly, too, that have experience, at the college level, that are ready to step into maybe bigger roles. And so I think Kansas did a nice job of that. We've talked quite a bit, even going back to this other transfer portal window, about sort of, okay, are you looking for an immediate impact player? Are you looking for a guy with multiple years of eligibility that you think can step into a future role? Are you looking for a depth piece, right? Those are kind of the overarching, I think, groups you could put some of the transfers into. And I think we saw KU this year really focus on getting some guys of immediate impact at certain positions, but also adding some depth in other areas. And so you kind of get to see a larger picture of what their general strategy was heading into this offseason. And we've also talked about this, Kevin. I mean, I don't think there's any way to beat around the bush. This is a massive offseason for Lance Leipold in this program. Consecutive 5 and 7 seasons, consecutive seasons of not making a bowl game. Now you're going to be having a new quarterback with the Jalen Daniels era ending. These are all Lance Leipold players in terms of recruits from the high school level and also guys who brought up from the transfer portal. So this is a massive offseason for them. And I think that this coaching staff seems to have recognized the gravity of that and attacked the transfer portal very heavily. And again, I think brought in some players that they expect and hope to make immediate impact for Kansas in 2026, because this is setting up to be sort of a potential watershed year in the direction of Lance Leipold at Kansas.
Yeah, of the 30 transfers they brought in, 18 have a chance to get extra eligibility. One of those is Nick McMillan, the wide receiver from Buffalo, who may have an injury redshirt. And so there's 17 guys that for sure have extra eligibility Nick McMillan could apply to get that extra year of eligibility. And so, yeah, not just 2026, but setting up most of these guys, theoretically at least, because obviously with portal, you can lose a guy a year later, but setting up a lot of these guys potentially to be impact guys in 2027 as well. And so when you look at, I think there's not a better group to kind of prove the point that you're talking about than that defensive tackle group, right? Like you go in, you've got Blake Harrell, who you feel like has all Big 12 potential. You get Trayvon McAlpine, who was a starting nose tackle for a program that was in the college football playoff and was really, really good. He is a plug and play. This is the guy that you probably want out there next to Blake Harrell. But in addition to that, you got Eamon Smalls, who's got a couple years of eligibility left, can play either tackle spot. You go to the Division II ranks, you get Jabril Condé, a guy from Grand Valley State who can play sort of that Blake Harrell role where he can play, a one gap tackle, or you can bump him out to defensive end when you want to get a little bigger there, as KU has done at times. And then you add Kevin Otis, who's got 4 years of eligibility left, redshirted this year at Arkansas, a former highly touted recruit, a guy with a lot of ability. He's not somebody that you're necessarily thinking, hey, this guy's going to come in and start this year, but you are saying 2027, 2028, theoretically, down the line, this could be one of the foundational guys of that defensive tackle group. And so you're not just grabbing guys to start this year. I mean, you did that with McAlpine, like that. He is a guy who has that kind of ability. Smalls could start. He's got that kind of ability, but he's a multi-year guy. But then you've got the depth behind those starters, and then you add in a guy like Otis that is potentially going to make you better down the line. And so I think that's a good indicator, just using one position group to say, hey, here's the way to address this by, one, filling your needs, 2, filling out your depth, and 3, getting guys for the future. The other thing I'd say, just with the transfer portal rankings, and we've said this before, remember, those are done in a vacuum. Like it's just straight up how talented we think this guy is, and the impact he could have without considering what school he's going to. And so these guys have obviously been evaluated specifically for Kansas, brought in to fill specific needs, to fill certain spots. The other thing is, Nick, I'm not sure that the recruiting services have gotten to a point yet when evaluating transfers where they have the big staffs putting all the resources into it that you see with them evaluating from the high school level. And so I still think there's maybe a little bit of catching up to do there. And even beyond all of that, Nick, it's really tough to evaluate transfers because there are guys who are super talented that didn't play because they were at a program that had a ton of talented guys around it. Emmanuel Henderson got all Big 12 mention last year. His first team all Big 12 as a kick returner, made third team as a wide receiver in one of the 2 teams as well. And he was a guy that had like 5 catches the previous year at Alabama. Then you've got guys like Leroy Harris. Nobody would have expected what happened with Leroy Harris to happen a year ago. And so all of that is to say, it's like you're aiming at a moving target while blindfolded, and the blindfold is pulled down maybe just here so you can see a little bit. You're not entirely blind, but you are shooting at something that's very, very difficult to hit, and you really have to trust in your evaluations. They have to trust in sources in a lot of cases, because maybe these are guys that they evaluated out of high school. Maybe they were talking to a guy who was on that staff that they knew, who said, hey, a guy like Bam Crouch just entered the portal. We think he'd be a good fit for you. And so there are all these different things that go into, is this guy a transfer take for Kansas? And it's so much more, as you were saying, than just this guy is an 87 rated player on 24/7 Sports, because that's really not how it works.
Oh, and by the way, everything that you just described all has to happen within about a couple of days' time. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, on top of that, you're also dealing with almost certainly an agent who is going to be trying to negotiate the money aspect of this whole thing, right? So
if money wasn't an object, I'm sure KU would have gone after, Jaden Woods and, all these different guys and everything. But yeah, I mean, and they had to split that over 30 guys, right? And I'm not saying all 30 of those guys were making the same amount or were the same level of guy, but to some extent, you have to decide, like, are we going to take these 6 players who could maybe help us, or are we going to take that 6-player pool and splash it on one guy that could maybe be an all Big 12 type of guy? In this case, they had so many roster spots to go ahead and fill, and I thought they did a nice job of that.
Yeah, and again, all those evaluations have to happen within days. I mean, we're not talking about, hey, months or years at the high school level, like you probably are so familiar with, Kevin. You're talking about these evaluations having to happen within 48 hours, 72 hours of determining, hey, do we want this kid? What do we know about him? What's he going to cost? And can we, get him on campus, or can we get him to commit? All that has to happen within literally a few days. And so it's obviously a very, very hectic time period. Kansas, ended up getting close to 30 guys in total. And I think at this point, I mean, we're sitting here at the end of January. You have to feel okay. I mean, there's no reason, I don't think, to feel too negative about this situation for Kansas. I feel like they have brought in some guys that can help them. We're going to talk about some of those guys more specifically as well later on in the show. But I guess right now, yeah, you just have to say, okay, you feel all right about it. You've brought in some players. You have a team. And it's just a matter of, taking those pieces and fitting them together into a cohesive unit on both sides of the ball and rolling it out there in September and trying to win some football games.
Yeah. And some of it's almost kind of random, right? I mean, we heard this past year the story of how Emmanuel Henderson wound up at Kansas. He was going to visit K-State, and Jaleel Hurley was in the bucket for Kansas and was like, hey, man, like, you were at Alabama with me, like, while you're in the area, like, why don't you swing by? And that's how Kansas got an all Big 12 transfer. So there is, an element of randomness to it as well. Obviously, in some cases, you're going to have injuries that impact things. Dean Miller doesn't get hurt. Does Leroy Harris have the start of the year that he has, and winds up stretching that out? Obviously, Leroy Harris now is kind of a foundational part of that KU defense. When you look at it and say, hey, who are the best players and who are you really counting on this next year? A year later, it's Leroy Harris. And so when we talk about these guys, Nick, yes, we're going to talk about them with regard to 2026, but keep in mind, some of these guys are guys that could do the Leroy Harris route, where they're going to find a spot this year, be pretty good, but 2027, they're going to be one of your guys with an exclamation point next to their name in terms of what you're expecting from them.
Let's go through some of these position groups and talk a little bit more about some of the guys we like, our favorite picks, and maybe some under-the-radar names to keep an eye on. We'll do all that coming up next.
My name is Terrell Jolly. A lot of people call me TJ, founder and CEO of Integrity Capital Management. So Integrity Capital Management originally started out as a property management firm, but we slowly transitioned to what is described as an incremental development firm that's focused on situational housing. I know most people say affordable, but we believe in creating housing for people that are actually in need and built to the end user. I believe everyone needs a home, because when you have home, you have hope. The reality is that when you're building a business, one thing you don't think about is like what a true banking relationship means. And, I had the honor and privilege of meeting Debbie early on in my career when I was just trying to get going. And as a small business, it's really challenging at times because people don't understand the concept or not believe the longevity because you're just getting started. But Debbie was willing to take a chance on me, be patient with me. I almost look at it like a grassroots initiative. She's seen and believe what I'm about. Anybody that's really true about their business and want to get some things done, I would definitely trust hands down Emprise, because Deb's team, along with Aaron and Jackie and all the amazing people that work behind the scenes, even from the treasury side, I would say, hey, give them an opportunity, because you won't be disappointed and you will actually be in hands that actually somebody care and that will see you from start to finish.
This is the Peggy Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. If you haven't already, I don't know what you're waiting for, subscribe on Apple and Spotify for audio and on our YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. And again, you'll want to be subscribed on YouTube, because that's where we do our YouTube live shows after KU basketball games this spring. We were live after every KU football game this past season. We're going to be continuing that obviously into the fall as well. So you want to be subscribed so you can come join us for our live reaction post-game shows including coming up this Saturday when Kansas hosts BYU at Allen Fieldhouse. College Game Day is going to be there, and we'll be live after the game, so come hang out with us and join us for that. Best way to do that is to hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified when we go live. Let's start with the offense here, Kevin, as we kind of go through some of our more breakdowns of these different guys that Kansas brought in via the transfer portal. We're talking about the defense a little bit later in the show. Let's start with the offense, and let's start with a position group that for a while neither you or I expected Kansas to have a transfer, and that's at the quarterback position. It seemed like Kansas maybe was not interested in a quarterback transfer. We had that breaking news about David McComb back in December. He announced his intentions to transfer. He ended up going to Miami, Ohio. And it seemed like Kansas was kind of content to just roll with Isaiah Marshall and Cole Ballard. Late in the cycle, they got an opportunity to bring in a guy. Sure enough, they did. Chase Jenkins from Rice, who had started at Rice in 2025. So he's a guy with, not Power 4 experience, but, D1 starting experience at a Group of 5 school. He comes in and, like we kind of talked about before, presumably he will be in the heat of battle for that starting job. So now you've essentially have a 3-horse race for that starting quarterback position starting now.
Yeah, and I think, for a lot of the transfer portal process, it looked more likely that they were just going to keep Mikey Pauley, as a quarterback full time. And basically, remember, Mikey Pauley, he's a walk-on, but he was a guy that was offered scholarships out of high school. And so he's not really a quote unquote walk-on from that standpoint in terms of an ability or what you think of a lot of times when you think of a walk-on. And so it seemed like those were going to be the four that Kansas was going to go to battle with, right? The two guys competing for the starting job, Cole Ballard, Zeke Marshall. Then you were going to have Mikey Pauley, maybe spending all of his time at quarterback, and then going ahead and bringing in Jalen Mason, who, has some ability, but, probably some rawness too that a red shirt would really benefit him. But you bring back Andy Kotelnicki, and I think it's probably not a coincidence that late in the process, all of a sudden, Kansas starts popping up on a couple quarterbacks' radars. And so I think, when you look at what Kotelnicki does and his offense, Paulie's maybe not as much of a fit for that specifically as some other people might be. And that's where Chase Jenkins comes in. You mentioned the experience. The big thing that I noticed more than the experience is just this is a guy that should be able to run Kotelnicki's offense, right? You should be able to do all the option stuff. He's got great speed, good legs, is mobile, doesn't push the ball down the field super well from a passing standpoint, at least not yet. But at the same time, you're adding another scheme fit type guy to that Cole Ballard, Zeke Marshall battle. And I think you put it well. I fully expect Jenkins to be in that battle for that starting quarterback spot as it stands right now. A nice late portal ad at a very important position.
Yeah, I don't think it would have made sense for Kansas to add a quarterback unless they thought that quarterback was going to have a chance to compete. And from the perspective of a guy like Chase Jenkins, why would he want to come to a place where he was a starter previously at Rice? Why would he want to go somewhere where he's not guaranteed a shot at the starting job, right? So obviously, I think from both parties' perspectives, the expectation is that Jenkins will compete for the starting job. Will he win it? Obviously, time will tell. We'll see how things unfold in the spring and in the summer as we get into fall camp. But yeah, I think an addition that now gives you an extra level of competition in that room that, as Lance Leipold has preached since he's gotten here, competition is always a good thing, right? And you've added another guy into that room. Another room that needed a reset, quite frankly, after losing Daniel Highshaw and losing LeSean Williams, and then you end up losing Harry Stewart and Johnny Thompson to the transfer portal as well, was that running back room. Kansas went out early in the portal process, got two guys pretty quickly with Jalen Dupree from Colorado State and Yasin Willis from Syracuse. Kevin, you like to say that Kansas clearly had a type when they were looking for their running backs with those two guys who are more bigger, beefier, stockier, downhill, one-cut type running backs. But it did feel like KU was maybe missing a guy that could maybe be that lightning, be that explosiveness that they need, especially when you talk about Emmanuel Henderson moving on from Kansas after the type of season he had last year. I know it was at the wide receiver position, but still, you want to have, that type of player with that type of game-breaking speed. And sure enough, it works out that Kansas does end up landing a guy in the form of Dylan Edwards, who we talked about extensively when he committed to KU. Obviously, he's a guy from Kansas, has a history here, played at Derby, ended up at K-State after he was previously at Colorado. Things didn't work out there. feels like an opportunity for him to hit the reset button, come to Kansas, maybe have a chance to prove himself. But that's going to be your running back room, I think, is those three guys really. And, you talk about Dupree and Willis, who I think should be fairly complementary. And then obviously you hope to unlock some of that potential out of Edwards, where maybe he can be sort of that home run hitter type guy that you sort of had in the form last year of Emmanuel Henderson. But when you look at this running back room, Kevin, how are you feeling about it right now?
Yeah, I think KU was looking for a Dylan Edwards type to go with those other guys, because you also look at the fact that they kicked the tires on Jalen Lucas before winding up with Dylan Edwards. Dylan changes the outlook of this room to me, because I like Willis. I think there's a lot to like there. I think Dupree checks a lot of the same boxes that Harry Stewart would have checked if he had stuck around. Justin Thurman is coming back from an injury, but is a guy that we really like on this show. Think he has some ability. Running back is one of those positions you can play early, and Corey Amakri is a pretty good running back, and so he's potentially going to be in that room. But you didn't necessarily have a game-breaking type of guy. Willis, I think, is more of, he's going to clock you with his pads over and over again. And Dupree is somewhat similar. And that's where Dylan really comes in. Dylan gives you somebody that, we all talk about the speed. He can make guys miss as well. And he has that ability to just accelerate by people. It's not just the top end speed. The top end speed's impressive, but where he really gets you is, man, you open up that hole and he's past the linebackers before they even realize that the hole was there. And so I think he changes a lot for this room. You look at some of the stuff they did last year in terms of how they threw the ball to the back out of the backfield on the wheel routes. And for Le'Shawn Williams to have some of the plays that he had in the passing game, you had to trick the defense, right? Like they had to step up and then you could throw it over their head. Dylan Edwards can just run by somebody. If you have him out in the flat and then wheel him out and there's a linebacker out there, he knows the route, Dylan can still just outrun that guy and you've got a chance at a really big play. And so I think Dylan really changes the look of that room. And we've talked about this on the show a little bit, Nick. They have a type at Kansas, right? When you look at how Devin Neal was, you even look at some of the guys that, didn't start but were in the program, Savion Morrison, Kai Thomas, Daniel Highshaw, Le'Shawn Williams. But at Buffalo, it was Jarrett Patterson. And Jarrett Patterson is a guy that was a one-play touchdown if you block things right. And Dylan Edwards gives them a chance to kind of go back to their roots a little bit with that one too.
Shout out to the Butler Community College Grizzlies, man. Shout out to them. And shout out to Buffalo too. But yeah, Jarrett Patterson's a good pull, because you're right. I believe he was a multi-year 1,000-yard back, right, at Buffalo under Lance Leipold. So a really talented guy. And not that I think Dylan Edwards is going to be a 1,000-yard guy for Kansas this season, but you get the idea of the type of explosiveness that he can bring to that room. And, last year it was obviously very frustrating with the fact that Daniel Highshaw and Le'Shawn Williams were both kind of healthy at opposite times. They were banged up, it didn't really have very many games where those two guys were together healthy at the same time. So health obviously will be something to keep an eye on as well with this room. But I think you feel good about the fact that, hey, between Willis and Dupree, you've got two guys that you feel like, hey, it's 3rd and 2 and we just want to muscle our way for a first down. You can do that. But then you also have Dylan Edwards, who can be maybe that potential X factor guy and make plays for you, outside the tackles in the passing game, make guys miss in the open field, run by guys and create in that way as well. So overall, I think you feel pretty good about where this running back room is after some of the departures you had and what Kansas brought in return. When you look at the pass catchers, I'm just going to kind of lump the wide receivers and tight end discussion in together here, sort of just the pass catching group. But when you look at wide receiver, Kansas added Nick McMillan, who actually, funnily enough, was at Buffalo, and Najee Cox, who was previously at Middle Tennessee State. You look at tight end position, you bring in Jalen Butler and Carter Moses to pair with Carson Brune, who's going to be returning as well. Obviously, you have Cam Pickett back as well at the wide receiver position. And this is something that's very intriguing to me, Kevin. This conversation is maybe my favorite, because we talked about McMillan and what he could bring as sort of that possession catch guy. Cox is a little bit of a bigger frame receiver who can maybe run down the field and be sort of your deep threat. But I'm curious for your thoughts on the tight ends as well, because Jalen Butler had less than 10 catches last season at Old Dominion in his previous stop. But I know you like his body, you like his athleticism, and then Carter Moses from Albany could be a potential X factor as well. What do you think of the weapons that Kansas has put together from a pass catching standpoint for who knows, by the way, at quarterback?
Moses doesn't have a cloak of invisibility, but he does give a little Bowden Bruin to him. And I think, there are times that you see him, get into his stride a little bit. It's almost like the defense forgets that he can run a little bit. Butler is the intriguing one to me, just in that there's a chance with KU's tight ends, Nick, that Butler doesn't wind up playing that big of a role, that he kind of fits into, he kind of falls into a hole, and there's a chance that he winds up leading KU's tight ends in catches. And the reason I say that is you mentioned the production at Old Dominion. He had, I know some people felt like he was a better blocker than receiver there. Had some good clips as a blocker. I wasn't like blown away by him as a blocker. But the number of times, Nick, that he'd be running a route and you'd be like, man, this kid's got a little juice to him, and the ball wouldn't see him. And that's why we watch the tape, right, Nick? Like, that's why we don't just say, oh, this guy had 9 catches, he's not a receiving tight end, is because it wouldn't surprise me if he had a bigger receiving impact at Kansas than he had at Old Dominion, even though the level of competition goes up, just because he might not get ignored when he runs a route and gets open. And I'm not saying they were intentionally ignoring him or anything like that. I just think there's more juice to be squeezed there with him as a receiver. And so there's a chance that you look at him and say, hey, he doesn't wind up blocking as well as Carson Bruin. We've got some other guys in there, and he doesn't really wind up finding a major role. And there's a chance that he winds up duplicating some of what Deshaun Hanukkah did a year ago in terms of being a tight end that can run and get into open spots. And so he has more of an impact as a receiver than maybe you thought he would.
Let's talk about your favorite area, Kevin, the trenches, the offensive line. The offensive line. Kansas went out and added 4 different offensive linemen via the transfer portal. You added in potentially 2 tackles with Connor Stroh and Nick Morrow. I know we've talked about the possibility of Stroh, who played both tackle and guard at Texas, to potentially maybe have a conversation at guard as well. You added Kason Carpenter from Oklahoma State at the center position, and then Trezell Jenkins from a lower level as kind of your wild card potentially to add in with the guys that you have. Look, this is honestly, Kevin, I was trying to think about this just off the top of my head. Has Kansas had to replace this many starters off of an offensive line for Lance Leipold since he's gotten here? Because you're replacing 3 starters basically. When you think about losing, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the Syracuse tackle, Enrique Cruz. You lose Enrique Cruz, you lose Bryce Foster, you also lose Kobe Baines. That's 3 starters that you're trying to replace. You'll have Calvin Clements back. You figure Amir Herring is probably going to be a starter, whether that's at center or at guard is up for debate at this point. But that's 3 offensive linemen. I don't know that Kansas has had to replace that many guys under Lance Leipold.
I think they did it last year.
Okay.
Because you lost Cable Dew, Logan Brown, and I think one of the guards, right?
Yeah, you would have lost Armandre Adams, right?
Not Armage. No, it was, sorry. I feel awful like blanking on this, but you had Bryce Foster and Kobe Baines on one side. Right. And and then you lost one of the guards. Calvin Clements wasn't a starter, remember? So last strike
Michael Ford.
Thank you. I feel awful about that because Michael Ford's a multi-year starter, right?
Listen,
we get brain lock up sometimes. But yeah,
that's how good Michael Ford was he was so good we never talked about him because he did his job.
Joe Posnanski wrote this amazing column once at the Kansas City Star, basically about Will Shields for the Chiefs that way. And he was like, the best thing about Will Shields is you never, ever notice Will Shields, and so it was a great, he never commits penalties. He never blows blocks. He never, you can just forget that he's out there, but no, they did it last year in terms of returning 3 starters. And it took the offensive line a while to find their footing last year. The offensive line the previous year, I think, was one of the better offensive lines in the country with how well they played, and the stats certainly bear that out as well. And then you look at it last year, It took them a while to kind of find their right combination. It took Calvin a little while to find his confidence. I believe the Texas Tech game, both Calvin and Enrique Cruz graded out at 0.0 from a pass protection standpoint. And granted, Texas Tech is great. I'm just saying it took them a little while to find their footing. And you hope that that's not as much the case with these guys, even though you are going to have 3 new starters again. The one thing I do really like about this group, though, Nick, all 4 of the guys you mentioned have multiple years of eligibility left. And so what we're talking about right now in terms of not a hard reset necessarily, but somewhat of a reset, you're potentially not going to have that next year, because you can have another year of Calvin. You can have another year of Amir, I think. And so these guys can be back, and so you can potentially have a really good offensive line in 27 with these guys coming back. But overall, they did a nice job of, I think Morrow is going to be a plug and play starter at tackle. I really do. I don't know if that's, he played left tackle at Cal. I don't know if they're going to push Calvin to the right side, or if they're going to say, hey, Calvin's got the left side, you're on the right side. But I think Nick is probably going to wind up starting at one of those tackle spots. And that's where it gets interesting after that. I think Jenkins is more of a developmental guy for the future, but Stroh could start at a tackle spot or a guard spot. Kason Carpenter could start at center or at a guard spot. And so the versatility and the fact that both of those guys can be kind of swing guys, I think really helps this room out a lot.
Yeah, I think Kason Carpenter's the wild card here, because is he going to be your starting center?
He might.
I don't know. Very well could be. Right. Very well could be. And so I think he's kind of the wild card, because if he is able to do that, and you're able to say, okay, Amir Herring, you're at guard, Connor Stroh could compete, whatever that is. But if Carpenter is able to lock down that center spot, your offensive line is going to be set, I think, at that point, right?
Yeah.
So that's to me kind of the key storyline, I think, at least on the offensive line, is that center position this spring, and whether or not Carpenter could be a guy that could win that job. Because if he doesn't win it and it ends up being like Amir Herring, I don't think that's a bad thing, right? But if you're looking at this and saying right now, we want our best 5 guys to be our starters, I think in that scenario you would want Carpenter to be in that discussion and be your center, right? I think, at least at this stage. So we'll see how things unfold on the offensive line. But yeah, that'll be interesting to watch, because I love what you said about the future of the offensive line. What concerns me about that, Kevin, is that if that offensive line does take time again in 2026, plus you have a new quarterback, could that really hamper the offense, this season, if you have those issues, right? Where if your offensive line takes a little bit of time to get into the season, and you're trying to also integrate in a new quarterback as well, as a starter, that would be my concern there. So we'll see. Let's take a break, and then we'll break down the defense. What do you say? We'll do that coming up next.
What is happening, good people? It is Benny Heiss, KCSN betting analyst. And guess what? We got the Super Bowl coming around just in the nick of time. Cannot wait. And listen, it's the Super Bowl. Super Bowl 60 deserves a sportsbook that is built for the moment, and DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of Super Bowl 60, puts you right in the center of the biggest game of the year. Listen, we've seen some wild Super Bowls, right? And we've also seen that anything can happen during the Super Bowl. And the good news is that DraftKings will have your back with early exit. If a player goes down in the first half, you still get paid in cash immediately once your bet settles. No bonus bets, no waiting. It's that easy. Taking a look at the early line here, right now we're seeing the Seahawks at -4.5 at -115 odds over at DraftKings Sportsbook, which means the Patriots +4.5 as underdogs at +190 on the money line, with a total of 46.5. Whether you're looking at the actual game itself, the different possibilities for Super Bowl MVP, or you're just looking to get in on some of these wild and wacky props that are available only during the Super Bowl, you can get those over at DraftKings. And remember, if you're new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if your bet wins. All you have to do is download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use the code KCSN. That's code KCSN to turn $5 into $300 in bonus bets if your bet wins. In partnership with DraftKings, the crown is yours. If you have a gambling problem, remember to call 1-800-GAMBLER. You must be 21 plus, physically present in Missouri. Eligibility and restrictions apply. Bet must win to receive bonus bets, which expire in 7 days. Minimum odds required. For additional terms and responsible gaming resources, see dkng.co/audio. Limited time offer.
This is the paid podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer here with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible. Member FDIC. I feel like I shouldn't even have to say it at this point, but if you haven't subscribed, please do so on Apple and Spotify on audio and on YouTube channel at Kansas Jayhawks KCSN. And if you've made it this far without subscribing, what the heck are you doing? It takes one click, hit that button. It takes one touch if you're listening on audio. So please subscribe so you'll be notified when our new shows come out. And again on YouTube, you'll be notified when we do our live shows. We're going to be live coming up on Saturday afternoon after KU and BYU at Fieldhouse. I want you to be there. Kevin wants you to be there. Come join us. Come hang out with us and many other great KU fans this Saturday afternoon. All right, let's shift to the defense here, Kevin. You spent some time earlier in the show kind of talking about the interior, so we'll maybe run through this one a little bit quicker. But on the D-line up front, this was a position group that last year I think you and I both felt was a real strength of the team, were some of the veterans they had up front when you talk about especially what Keenan Caldwell ended up giving you last season. And then you added in, Tommy Dunn, DJ Withers. Well, those guys are all gone now. And you're turning the page on this interior defensive line group. And Blake Harold is kind of now your main guy in that room. But you mentioned it. They brought in Trevon McAlpine to be sort of the instant impact player in the middle, who was an all-conference player at Tulane. And Tulane obviously ended up going to the college football playoff this past season. They added in Eamon Smalls from UAB, added in a guy from the D2 level in Jabriel Conde. When you talk about Blake Harold as well with Marcus Calvin, that feels like KU has set themselves up to have another strong interior of the D-line.
Yeah, you look at Otis for the future, like we talked about. Marcus Calvin obviously did some really nice things a year ago. You're 6 deep again, and that's not including a guy in Cheese Hammond that, KU
Wait a minute. I think you just like saying Cheese Hammond.
I think there's a possibility that that's the case. Although I would prefer to say it Hammond Cheese, as I've said before, but Cheese Hammond, typically when KU has a guy coming off a redshirt year, that guy puts himself into position to get a few reps here and there. It's maybe not a lot, but just sort of feel the sun on their face, so to speak, out there on the field. And they climb into bigger roles. We saw that with Marcus Calvin. We saw that with like Harold, with some of these other guys as they were coming up and through. And so I love this group, Nick. I think the defensive tackle spot is the best position on the football team. I'm not sure it's particularly close for me, because I think you've got the frontline guys. I think you've got the depth. And then I also think you've got some talented guys for the future there too. Let's go ahead and throw David Santiago in there as well, and talk about the defensive line, because there's only one defensive end. Defensive end, bringing back Dak Brinkley and Leroy Harris was so huge. And KU has recruited and evaluated really well their young defensive ends, I think. Guys like Adrian Hawley, Garrett Martin in the program. You have Hunter Higgins coming in. Along with Drayden Punt. And I'm not saying all those guys are going to play right away, but I think they've got, sort of that level there. Alex Bray was a guy that helped them out at times last year, but he really wanted to bring in somebody who could be sort of a strong side defensive end and pitch in and help, who has some experience. And David Santiago, I think they got a guy that can start this year. It would not surprise me if he wound up beating out one of those guys and starting. I also think that if he's your number 3 defensive end behind those two guys, then he's going to be a really efficient and really good number 3. And so I thought they did a great job of adding another guy to that room who gives them a little bit more cover as guys like Adrian Hawley and some of the younger guys sort of find their footing in that room.
Yeah, I think the upside of the defensive end room is very exciting, right? Mm-hmm. You hope that Leroy Harris takes a step forward. I think, with Dak Brinkley, you hope that he's going to be somebody that also takes a big step forward. I guess, on the flip side of that, my concern would be if those guys don't take those steps forward, that room could again feel maybe a little lacking. So we'll see. You hope those guys can elevate and continue. But I like Santiago as well, like you outlined. He's a bigger guy on the edge, that somebody that should help you set the edge against the run, right? I think at times we saw with Dean Miller, he was attacked, not so much this past season, but in previous years for being that sort of lighter edge guy. Teams thought they could run the ball at him. I don't think you'll be able to do that with David Santiago. He's a much more built, thicker type of player on the edge. And so, yeah, I think it just comes down to, hey, can those guys take a step forward? You've added in Santiago as well to be in that conversation, but you would like to see this edge group generate more pressure this season, because outside of Leroy Harris, Kevin, we just didn't really see it very consistently, I don't think. And truthfully, even Leroy Harris, had a couple pop games, but you'd like to see him be more consistent as well and more pass rush for this Kansas D line. Let's move to possibly the most intriguing position group on defense. That is the linebacker core. I feel like we've talked so much about the linebacker core over the past 5 weeks, basically, about what that was going to look like. Were they going to get anybody back? It looked like no. Trey Lathan entered the portal, but didn't enter the portal, but still didn't enter the portal. And then it was like, okay, I don't know what's happening. Then he comes back. Kansas ultimately added 5 linebackers to that position group as well. So basically, you are doing a full reset plus Trey Lathan. And, we talked about this with Floyd Badunga last offseason. Feels like Trey Lathan, you could argue, is also one of KU's biggest wins out of the transfer portal, too, even though he never actually entered the transfer portal. But, fantastic to get him back. But then you added in Davion Crouch from Boston College, Landon Watson from Kentucky, Quincy Davis from New Mexico State, Jaron Willis from South Carolina, and Jibril Alameen from Marshall. This is a very interesting group with Lathan spearheading the way. And sort of, like we talked about, I think, before, without Lathan, I would be panicking. Flat out. With Lathan, I feel obviously significantly better. We'll see, obviously, how things end up shaking out in terms of who's going to pair with him and what that rotation will look like. But with Lathan, I do feel like there is a solid floor now for what this group, will be in 2026. And then we'll see how things unfold with the transfers they brought in.
We talked about some of the versatility on the defensive line of guys being able to play, multiple tackle spots or sliding out and playing end. And think about DK McDonald's defense a year ago, and how many looks they presented to other teams. You had 4-man front at times. You had their version of a bear front, which is 5 men at times. You had, a linebacker, you had 2 of them lining up next to each other with Bengali Kamara being off the ball. You had Bengali Kamara basically playing on the ball, almost like another edge guy. You had secondary guys moving around. And all of that is to say, there is no bigger position on this team, Nick, where I think you see Kansas's desire to get guys who can do different things and provide different looks than the versatility of this linebacker room. If you're playing somebody off the ball, like you saw there, I think Bam Crouch is the best guy for that, and was a really good player 2 years ago when he was healthy at Boston College, and could wind up being sort of a perfect pairing next to Trey Lathan. Well, okay, but then you have Landon Watson, who has played both off the ball and on the ball. He was a high school defensive end, so he's got experience playing up on the ball and rushing the passer and all the things that come along with that. The guy with the most potential is maybe Willis, right? Even though he didn't play a lot at South Carolina, he's a good athlete. He's explosive. If he takes to coaching, picks up the playbook, all of those things, you could be surprised by how big of a role he could play with this group. Quincy Davis is sort of your classic middle linebacker type, right? He's a thumper between the tackles and can give you some value there. And then you add in Jibril Alameen, and we talked about guys that can move around and do different things. You mentioned he's almost like a linebacker safety type hybrid, a little bit of that Craig Young type guy. And when you add that whole group together, there's a tool for every type of screw that you're going to have to deal with on the football field. And I think that we said that about the defensive line. We're going to say that about the secondary, but I think it's especially apparent with this group that the DK McDonald really wanted to have guys who could fill in and have strengths against the different types of things that they'll be facing, and to be able to do different things when he shifts and moves those guys around.
I think this is a classic case of, hey, you got all the pieces. Now you just got to figure out how they fit together, when they fit together, where they fit together, who plays well with who, what kind of formational situation are you going to be having? And then obviously when you're going up against an offense, who does the best against what, right? Kind of like you outlined. So we'll see. That obviously, I think for some fans that may be a little bit of a red flag because you're basically saying, okay, you have the pieces in place. Now DK McDonald, can he organize them to be the most effective? And obviously there is, I think, there's some real valid apprehension about DK McDonald with kind of how the defense was last season. But that's just kind of where it's at. I think in totality, and I know we'll talk about the secondary too, but let me just ask you this, Kevin, just real quick. I mean, flat out, is this defense on paper, as we're talking at the end of January, more talented than what KU's defense had last season in 2025?
I think they are. I absolutely think they're deeper. And I think that that's going to be a key thing, too, is if the wrong guys got hurt a year ago, they would have really been in a world of pain. And when some of the guys did get hurt and they had to move players around, you saw some of the struggles there. And I think that this group is deeper, but I do think that, to your point, they are more talented. And the reason I say that is I'm not saying all of these guys are going to be all Big 12, Nick, but I think you have a potential all Big 12 guy at each level of the defense. I think Leroy Harris is a potential all Big 12 guy. I think Blake Harold is a potential all Big 12 guy. I think Trey Lathan coming back is a potential all Big 12 guy. Jalen Todd, I think we would agree, is a guy that has all Big 12 potential at cornerback. And I think Corey Gordon is a guy at that safety level that is potentially an all Big 12 guy. And that's not saying Corey Gordon's the only one of these transfers that has that ability. McAlpine could maybe be that guy. But I don't think last year when you went into the year, you felt like you had that at each level of the defense. Jalen Todd had played pretty well the previous year, but hadn't gone through a full year as the guy or the starter at that position. At safety, I don't know that we felt like any of those guys were no doubt, all Big 12 candidates. There was the potential that maybe a couple of those guys could get their linebacker. You were starting over. You had no idea what you had with Bengali Kamara and Trey Lathan. And so to me, you're returning guys that have that potential, I think. But even in addition to that, you filled in some of the holes around them to where I don't think there are as many weaknesses or apparent weaknesses. And I think, too, the upper tier talent is probably better than it was a year ago, too.
You mentioned Corey Gordon. I think that gives us a good opportunity to transition into the secondary. Corey Gordon from Louisville, one of the most experienced transfers Kansas brought in. I think you hit the nail right on the head with what he potentially could be for KU at the safety position. You also brought in Keyshawn Cummings-Colin from Iowa State, who started and played some time at Iowa State. You brought in Pritchett from Georgia Tech as sort of more of one of your depth pieces. But, yeah, I mean, I look at the safety room, Kevin, and quite frankly, I'm expecting Corey Gordon to start right away. And I think at some point over the course of the season, Keyshawn Cummings-Coleman is going to be starting as well, right? They're going to be battling, obviously, with Taylor Davis. You have Mason Ellis sort of in that conveation as well. But this is
Jayden Harris, too.
Jayden Harris, right.
Who started at Miami. And yeah, so, I mean, it's going to be a competition. It's going to be heated in that room.
Yeah. And it's a group that I think you have a little bit more versatility. I love what you were mentioning with the linebackers because I feel the same way about the safeties, right? I think with Lyric Rawls, he was really, really good at coming downhill, making big hits, playing sort of that box safety, but I think he was limited in other areas, and I think that got exposed a little bit at times for Kansas when you think back to the Cincinnati game and specifically where Kansas kind of struggled with their safeties and man coverage against Cincinnati's receivers. I think Corey Gordon gives you some more balance. I think Cummings-Coleman from Iowa State is somebody that could be like an OJ Burroughs type of player. I'm not saying that he will be him, but somebody who gives you that range on the back end of your defense. And then you pair that up with what KU has returning. I think that safety room has a chance to be pretty strong in 2026.
Yeah, I think Corey Gordon Jr., the thing that makes him so good is he could start at any of those spots across the safety room. When you look at the nickel, when they play that as a safety, when you look at boundary safety or free safety. And I think that gives them a lot of versatility, and that if, Cummings-Coleman is the guy that you think he is, Nick, at free safety, then you can move Gordon over to boundary safety or to that nickel spot. He doesn't have to be that free safety. If you feel like, okay, Cummings Coleman isn't quite there yet, but if we move Taylor Davis to boundary safety, this is where he's a little more comfortable, then you can keep him at that free safety spot. If you don't like what you have at that nickel spot, you can move guys around. Although I think if Mason Ellis is healthy and playing with confidence, he's got a chance to win that job. But I think that that's the thing that makes Gordon such an intriguing piece here, is the fact that it's not even about where he's at his best. It's where you're doing the best at filling in those other spots. And so if Jaden Harris, plays that boundary spot and you're like, man, we really like what we have here, then maybe Corey Gordon Jr. is your starter at free safety. And so I like the versatility of this group. In particular, I think I have a hard time believing Corey Gordon Jr. won't start somewhere, but where he starts, I think is going to be decided in the spring and the summer by how they feel about how the other guys are picking things up.
When you look at the cornerback room, you got Jalen Todd back, you have Austin Alexander back, you have Saeed Gibbs back. They did add from the transfer portal with Ball State corner Owen Pearson, who's sort of a bigger bodied corner that probably gives you a little bit of extra depth at that spot. As well. They also added Elijah Kanan, who was a special teamer from Mississippi State, to add some extra depth there. But I think the cornerback spot is the one spot where you look at it and say, okay, you've got guys back and you expect those guys to step up and continue to be, your top guys when you talk about Jalen Todd and Austin Alexander, and I think Saeed Gibbs as well.
Yeah, there's a process with cornerbacks. A lot of times they get toasted and they get better over the course of getting toasted, right? And so I know we've talked about Austin Alexander that way, and that Alexander had a few big plays last year. He was put into some tough spots, and you expect him to deal better with those tough spots this year than he did a year ago. And you saw that with Mello Dotson, who got picked on, quite frankly, for a while before Mello Dotson figured things out. Kobe Bryant, for a while in his career was a playmaker where he would either get beat or he would make a big play, and kind of got to a point where he was more consistent. So I think you can expect more consistency out of Austin Alexander. You didn't even mention Jaleel Hurley as a guy who's got a lot of ability as well, and in his second year in the system could be somebody that plays a whole lot. But yeah, I really like Roman Pearson. I think he's going to be one of those top 3 or 4 corners potentially. You're going to see him on the field. Somebody that I talked to who had seen Pearson play actually felt like he could also play safety in a pinch. And I know that they filled out that safety room, but just something to think about, that he has some versatility, could move around, could do some different things. And then, like we've talked about with so many of these guys, I think Elijah Kanan is the guy that you develop for the future. He's got some traits to him. You like him. And he's maybe not necessarily going to be in that group this year, but he's somebody that you can start bringing up sort of behind those guys, along with McCorkle, who redshirted this past year, has some ability, and then they brought in some guys in this recruiting class as well. And so he can be maybe one of the sort of jewels of your younger cornerback group in there as well.
Okay, Kevin, we covered a ton of ground, I think.
And not even the special teams guys, Nick.
I know. I don't want to forget about the special teams. Special teams, you added Martin Connington as your kicker. He was a freshman at Michigan State last year. He's your kicker. That's your guy. That's who you're rolling with at the kicker spot to replace Laith Marjan. And when you look at the punter spot, Finn Lappin, I think we had this conversation last time we talked about this. He's back, I think.
He's gone.
Oh, he is gone. Okay. Gosh, dang it. I couldn't remember. I know we had this conversation before. Listen, live podcasting people, sometimes these things happen. So you brought in a new punter as well, who I'm also blanking on the name of, to be your new punter. And we can't forget the new long snapper.
That's why I wanted you to bring this up.
The previous long snapper who was the new long snapper who was previously at Notre Dame as well. So totally revamped on the special teams also.
Yeah, good old Rhino. Or is it Reno? I don't know. Is it Rhino?
I think it's Rhino, but I'm not really sure. I didn't even want to try his
Rhino. It's not spelled like Rhino, like RH. It's Rino. Hence I hope it's Rhino, because that would be awesome to basically have your long snapper be a guy named Rhino who, comes out of his, snap on punts or whatever, just kind of charging after people. That would be fantastic. We're getting off track a little bit, but at the same time, I would love it if it's pronounced Rhino, and I would love it if Rhino Montefiore wound up being a fan favorite for the Jayhawks.
Okay, what I was going to get to was, before we were thrown off track by the possibility of a Rhino on our team. Here's what I wanted to ask you, just to sort of wrap the show up, just really quickly. Obviously, I know we really talked about basically every transfer KU has, from the offense and from the defense. Who is your one favorite guy that KU added on those sides of the ball?
Offensively, it's Dylan Edwards. I mean, we've talked a lot about him on our shows. We talked about it even outside of the transfer group as a whole. We have a whole episode where we talk in large part about the addition of Dylan Edwards. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I just think Dylan brings so much game-breaking potential. And so Dylan's my guy on offense. On defense, it's tough because I like guys at each level. I would probably say Corey Gordon Jr., but it's really tough to pick between he and Trayvon McAlpine for me.
For me, offensively, I was really excited when they got him. I'm still excited. That's Nick McMillan, a wide receiver from Buffalo. 7 consecutive 100-yard receiving games for Buffalo last season to end the year there before he transferred to Kansas. I know he doesn't have that production against Power 4 schools, but I am still very, very excited about what he potentially could be as sort of that possession catch, security blanket, 3rd and 6. We need a guy that can make a tough play. I like Nick McMillan a lot. Defensively, first of all, could I cheat and say Trey Lathan? I don't think so, but I was just going to pose the question to you.
Yeah, of course it's good.
If it's not Trey Lathan, you mentioned
you got no rules on here, Dan.
That's true. This is pure anarchy on this show. If you're not going to let me say Trey Lathan, I think you named the other 2 guys, right? McAlpine and Corey Gordon. Those are the 2 guys that I think have by far the best chance to be bona fide game 1 starters and make a real impact for Kansas in 2026. Either one of those guys. And then real quick, before we wrap up the show, an under the radar player that you think could be somebody who makes an impact in 2026 on either side of the ball.
Yeah, under the radar. That's going to be tough. I think offensively, I love my guys in the trenches, Nick. An underrated guy, I think. I think most people feel like Nick Morrow is going to start and Connor Stroh is going to start. Kason Carpenter has a chance to potentially start in that group. And whether it's at center or guard, I'm not sure. Like you said, maybe the ideal thing is even him winning center and Amir Herring staying at guard. We'll see what that looks like, but I think Kason Carpenter has a chance to start, and he's not somebody that a ton of people are necessarily talking about. Defensively, I really like, Bam Crouch and Landon Watson. Also, if Rhino does wind up being a Rhino, Landon Watson is a Hutto Hippo. And so, I think KU's doing a really good job of building out the safari through this transfer class. But a guy that I think is really underrated in the way that he's discussed is David Santiago. And I think that he helps that defensive end room so much because when you look at the tape, when you look at the Pro Football Focus grades, this is a guy that can actually get after the passer and stop the run. And I think when there's so much to be excited about when you look at Leroy Harris and Dak Brinkley, there's a chance that Santiago beats one of those guys out. And even if he doesn't, we've seen how Kansas likes to kind of have their defensive line guys playing a lot of similar snaps. It felt like a defensive tackle a year ago. You'd look at the chart and be like 34 snaps, 33 snaps, 32 snaps, whatever. Santiago gives them a chance to basically have 3 starters at that position. And I think he could wind up producing beyond maybe what people are giving him credit for, just because you already have Dak Brinkley and Leroy Harris.
First of all, I can't believe you stole my flow on Kason Carpenter. That was going to be my pick. I was like, man, who's an under-the-radar guy that nobody's going to be talking about? Oh, I know, the center, Kason Carpenter. And then you just stole it right up from under my nose.
That's what I do.
Besides Kason Carpenter, you talked about it earlier in the show, but keep an eye on Jalen Butler potentially at the tight end position and what kind of role he could have. I don't think that Kansas has quite had a tight end with his athletic profile under Lance Leipold, Kevin. I mean, he's 6'4", over 240 pounds. He can run pretty well. Like, the tight ends we've seen have success at Kansas have not really been those types of guys. When you think about Mason Fairchild, when you think about Jared Casey, right? And Deshaun Hannick obviously was marred by injury, unfortunately, during his career at Kansas. But keep an eye on Jalen Butler potentially with the type of athletic profile that he has. And then defensively, I mentioned it just right at the end, but I think Keyshawn Cummings-Coleman is a guy that's going to have an impact for Kansas in the secondary. I don't know that he's going to necessarily start game one, but I think he's going to be somebody that is going to be playing quite a bit by the time you get into the second half of the season. So keep an eye on Keyshawn Cummings-Coleman, I think. And then honestly, I mean, at the linebacker spot, you can name any of those guys, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's really a crapshoot, I think, at this point in terms of, who could end up stepping up to be having a bigger role. But I think Davion Crouch is probably the betting favorite, I guess, to be sort of that number 2 guy. But you mentioned Jaron Willis, who has all that experience and was a highly recruited player at South Carolina. You mentioned Jabriel Alameen, who can sort of play out in space, not necessarily like your prototypical, big linebacker. You have Landon Watson, obviously, so any of those guys. But I think Keyshawn Cummings-Coleman in the secondary will definitely be somebody to watch in 2026. All right. We have seriously covered a ton of ground in this episode, Kevin. Any final parting thoughts for our great listeners?
I think this was a pretty solid transfer class, and I'll just add that spring can't get here soon enough because we're excited to see these guys out there on a football field with Jayhawks on their helmets. We usually take a ton of photos of varying quality of these guys. So if you want to see what it looks like when a Hutto Hippo wears a Jayhawk, we should have you covered.
Yeah, you can follow us on social media at Payheed KCSN on Twitter for some of our thoughts. And like Kevin said, by the way, if it's a blurry photo, I can assure you it was taken by Kevin. I only take the clean photos, so just keep that in mind if you're scrolling through some of the pictures we have from spring. But yeah, I'm excited for spring for 2 reasons, Kevin. 1, because it's cold as hell and I'm tired of it. And I want it to be a little bit warmer. And 2, because we will have a chance to get out there and see some of these guys in action a little bit in spring practices and talk to some of the position coaches and some of the players as well about just how things are going for Kansas. So all that is to say, you should absolutely be subscribed and stay tuned for all of our coverage of KU football in the spring. And obviously you want to stay subscribed as well for Kansas basketball coverage, including coming up on Saturday when we'll be live after KU and BYU. We're going to be talking about KU and BYU later this week, previewing that matchup as well. So stay tuned for that. But until next time, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. We'll talk to you again soon. See ya.